So first of all, nice to see everyone. Welcome. Special welcome to Professor Capobianco for allowing us to have this opportunity to have a discussion about Heidegger and grace. We plan to do it basically in 3-4 parts. We both have a short presentation. I will be talking about the Boiron motive in Heidegger thinking, which is related to grace. Richard will be talking about Heidegger's interpretation of charcoal and also the topic of grace. And we'll ask each other a couple of questions and then we'll open up the discussion to everybody. So you'll get your chance to speak your mind. So this is the topic. You're hiding the topic, so but it's a picture of the abbey in Boiron. And Boiron is about 10 miles from Mesquite, where Heidegger was born. It's located on the Danube River, the first part of the river that starts in Donaueschingen, according to the locals. It's also called, this upper part of the Danube Valley, the Ista, which is this famous poem that Hölderlin wrote and Heidegger also interpreted in his first lecture course on Hölderlin in winter semester 34-35. Heidegger for the first time went down to Boiron with his mother when he was a 6-year-old boy. And he kept visiting this abbey. It's an arch-abbey, Benedictine monks. Also, as a pupil of the gymnasium in Constance, during the holidays, same when he moved to Freiburg to go to the other gymnasium, but he would spend a lot of his vacations at home in Mesquite and then go down to the abbey, spend a couple of days there. And also he became friends with the librarian. And Boiron, the monastery, was well known for its extensive library. There had more than 400,000 books there. So that was, of course, a big help for Heidegger. He kept going to Boiron basically until the 1933, almost every year at least once. And I'll have some notes about Heidegger's visits over the years. I'd like to start with this famous line of Heidegger's, which has to do with the whole topic. Well, move it down for the moment. Without this theological background, I should never have come upon the path of thinking. But origin always comes to meet us from the future. That's from this famous dialogue on language, this conversation with a Japanese professor. In German it reads, ohne diese theologische Herkunft wäre ich nie auf den Weg des Denkens gelangt. Herkunft aber bleibt stets Zukunft. Because in German you have this Kunft, both in Herkunft, the past, and in Zukunft, the future. I think this plays a role in the whole discussion about Heidegger's relation to theology, Christianity, his personal faith. It's a bit. How can I put you? So maybe this way. Well, I can move up a bit. No, can't. Father Verkade was the guest monk at Boiron in the years that Heidegger came there as a student. And he also befriended Heidegger. He's a Dutchman from origin. And he was also an artist and painter who was a part of the Boiron School of Art. And they started basically to use Byzantine elements in their decorations of the church. in especially the chapel in Boiron. It's worth a visit if you're ever in the area. So he writes about this. Wherever day after day, with the exception of the short hours of the night, prayers rise to heaven, not only from the monks, but also from numerous pilgrims. God's mercy, Gnade, also descends, and with her rest and peace. For the numerous pilgrims, there were could be 1,500 pilgrims at the same on the same day. It's really big. They had a guest house built especially for the pilgrims, which is a huge building with large 600 people at least, and they kept extending these buildings. Even those who inwardly feel strongly opposed to Catholicism, or even scold themselves against unbelievers, are seized by the religious atmosphere of Boiron. Many a visit to the Abbey Gate taught me about this, and the regular participation of many people of different faiths in our service, especially in the evenings, is undoubtedly partly due to this mysterious influence. That's something that Heidegger himself experienced in his stays when he was there. We also have a comment by Heidegger's friend, Romano Guardini, who you may know as an important theologian. Like Heidegger, when he gave his first lecture courses after the end of the Second World War and the end of the Nazi dictatorship, he would have 1,000, 1,500 people in his lectures at the University of Munich. But they already met in 1915 in Rickert Seminar when they were both students, and they would go on weekly walks in Freiburg. And Guardini writes about his first visit to Boiron in 1907. I remember my first visit there deeply. It was evening. We went straight from the train station to the Abbey and got what made our stay in the Abbey so warm and lively at the time. Our rooms not in the as yet non-existent guest wing, but in the cloister itself, an indescribable something that made you feel deeply at ease. Then we got something to eat and went to the compline. The church was already dark, only a few lights in the choir. The monks stood in their places and prayed by the beautiful psalms of the compline, which were then always the same by heart. Throughout the whole church there was a mystery, holy and sheltering at the same time. I think holy and sheltering are combined for Heidegger in this notion of grace. So one of the people Heidegger took to visit Boiron was his friend Elizabeth Blochman, who you know maybe from her correspondence with Heidegger that was published 30 years ago or something. And she was a Protestant woman. Was half Jewish and moved to England in the early 1930s. And Heidegger writes to her, because the truth of our existence is not an easy thing, corresponding to it, inner truthfulness has its own depth and diversity. It does not consist solely in the settling of rational considerations. It needs its day and the hour in which we have existence as a whole. Then we learn that in all its essentials, our hearts must remain open to grace. God, or whatever you call it, calls everyone in a different voice. We are not allowed to stick to the brittle made-up that today's people come up with, but have to worship the power and solidity of the great in history. The past of human existence on a large scale is nothing, but what we return to again and again when we have grown in depth. But this return is not a takeover of what has been, but a transformation. Because this was written, or this letter is post being in time. And he adds in the same letter, that already shows your position on the compline, which is the final mass that they celebrated in the evening. which had to give you more than high mass. The fact that man walks into the night every day is at most a banality for today's people, because he usually makes it the day, as he understands the day, as a continuation of a business and a tumult. In the compline, there is still the mythical and metaphysical elemental force of the night, which we must constantly break through in order to truly exist. Because the good is only the good of the bad. Today's people are proficient in organizing everything and everyone, but they are no longer able to collect themselves for the night. We seem to be and achieve something in the movement, but where there is rest and leisure, we no longer know what to do with ourselves. I was trying to paint a little bit a picture of Boron and that may have inspired Heidegger. Basically, in this letter to Blochmann, Heidegger alludes to three important topics that keep coming to light on his path of thinking. The first one is that Dasein exists mostly and initially inauthentically. Authentic existence is only given to us at rare moments. For Heidegger, the moment means the resolute being held out in resoluteness, so that we encounter the special possibilities and circumstances of the situation. The moment opens up our situation, and at once with it, our original being towards death. Second motive is these are moments of grace. In Heidegger's understanding of religion, the moments of divine grace is of decisive importance from the beginning. Devotion to God, and not an autonomous act of the subject, is decisive for the religious experience. Without grace, no one comes to true faith. The way to God then remains close to him. The religious experience must be led back into the inner unity of life, that is, the feeling. Only in feeling can we really be approached by God. The religious feeling, the feeling of dependence on God, should determine all our actions. Religion is worship, it is binding oneself to God by serving him. Heidegger will later speak of the mysterious moment of the undivided unity of intuition and feeling, one being nothing without the other. And finally, growing in depth refers to the concept earthliness, bodenständigkeit, that is central to Heidegger thinking. Earthly is that which is grounded, that which is good for something. Earthliness is a phenomenon that can be demonstrated in practical life experience. Of course, it also has to do with being at home. As a historically existing being, man has a relationship to his past, which he should make his own. What is interesting here is that the Benedictines have the stabilitas loci, that is, to remain tied to the mother house and spend their lives there. You can be transferred to somewhere else for a certain period of time, as for example, Father Verkade, who lived for a long time in Munich, Vienna, and Palestine because of his artistic training and work. But in the end, you will come back home. Stabilitas loci means stability of the place, or in other words, earthliness. So, share one more slide. Do it the other way around. So it always confuses me, this stuff. There's some from here. Oh, another citation from this letter. So for you, the compline has become a symbol of the fact that existence is held into the night and the inner necessity of daily readiness for it. We are fundamentally misguided in our search by prevailing activity and its successes and results. We think the essentials are to be manufactured and forgot, that it only grows when we are completely and in the face of night and evil, live according to our heart. This primordial negative is decisive. Do not put anything in the way of the depths of existence. So we could ask if monasticism and the church as an institution have not outlived each other in needy times. And Heidegger had the son of his brother Fritz, Heinrich Heidegger, became a priest as Heidegger was supposed to become when he was a student of theology. And Heidegger gave a speech at the dinner party when he had given his first, celebrated his first Holy Mass. And Heidegger says there, most of the natural gifts are brought by the native soil and the sky above it. That which is strong enough to grow towards the gift of grace grows out of them. But precisely these sources for the natural and solid growth of all that is essential for human beings are now more threatened than ever before. These sources cannot, let's see, where can I put you? For some reason. On the full screen, then I can read it. Can be saved from drying up by artificial measures either. And now I can make it big again. Meanwhile, where the springs still flow, we can protect their blessings and take charge of their holding sway. No organization can replace those natural growth forces. And for Heidegger and Boiron in particular, the native earth, the Danube house of his ancestors, which was also in the valley, belonged to the monastery, is about 1.5 miles from Boiron. His grandfather was born there, and all his great-great-grandfathers from 1700 on were born in that same house. The abbey and the sky above them have merged. This merging still preserves grace and lets the sources of earthliness flow. They are still taken into custody in the Boiron Abbey today, although it's a very different place than it was in its glory days. So that's the end of my little contribution. I don't know, Richard, you want to do your own?
Yes. Well. Thank you, Alfred. I just want to share with everyone. I mean, I had been reading Alfred's work here on Heidegger's experiences at the Archabbey. I was just fascinated, and I so much appreciate Alfred's work on this. I don't know too many other people who are bringing to light this kind of material. But I think it's decisive, and it's the beginning of this discussion or this conversation that I think needs to be ongoing. I mean, we're just making a beginning here, after all, in thinking through the implications. But I think what it brought home for me was how indelibly marked Heidegger was by these experiences at the monastery, at the abbey, and with these experiences of his early Catholic upbringing. You know what struck me when Alfred was talking was the line by Father Fercade that Alfred talked about earlier. And there's a line here where the father says, even those who inwardly feel strongly opposed to Catholicism or even scold themselves against unbelievers are seized by the religious atmosphere of Boiron. Now, in a way, you could say that Heidegger himself was someone who was deeply conflicted, of course, by his Catholic upbringing, deeply conflicted. And we see that throughout his lifetime of philosophical thinking. But that line, in a way, illuminates something about Heidegger, as I hope to just suggest here, that even though he had a great quarrel with Catholicism, although he had a great quarrel with Christianity, although he was fiercely opposed to Thomism, to the Thomistic scholastic philosophy that he grew up with. And of course, I've talked to Jude about this many times. But despite this kind of ferocious battle with Catholic tradition, with Catholic culture, with Catholic philosophy in particular, he was nonetheless indelibly marked in some very significant ways. And that's what I want to just talk about a little bit here. Recently, I've posted a few notes that are moving in this direction, and I thought that I would talk a little bit about them. Some of you perhaps have not read those notes that I posted. So I mentioned that in The Birth of Tragedy, in section 18, Nietzsche has this wonderful and very famous phrase, and he speaks of, quote, the eternal wound of existence, unquote. And in Nietzsche's view, of course, this eternal wound of existence is covered over or disguised by Apollonian beauty and all other Apollonian efforts. And Nietzsche wished to confront us with the pain and suffering of existence and to challenge us to accept and embrace it heroically, rather than to deny it or hide from it under the blanket of aesthetic, scientific, metaphysical, and religious illusions. I might just say, as an aside here, that nonetheless, Nietzsche's assessment of existence is itself a metaphysical position. He doesn't escape making metaphysical assessments. It's just very different from the metaphysical positions that, of course, he understands to be illusions or escapes from the reality that he understands to be the case. And as I'm thinking about this wonderful phrase, this very compelling phrase, the wound of existence, I think that we can agree that for us human beings, there is the pain of our personal histories, the traumas of our own life situation. There are the historical and cultural wounds that we really have no choice but to take up in our lives. And in one of my notes, I mentioned that this is what the Christian philosophers and theologians understood by original sin, right? We find ourselves having to deal with a problematic human situation, a human situation that is encumbered and trammeled. Now, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that I am pointing to the doctrine or the dogma of original sin. I'm not interested in that, and I don't think Heidegger was that interested in that. But nonetheless, it is a description of the human condition that is very much in sync with what Nietzsche calls here the eternal wound of existence. And as I'll suggest in a moment, precisely also in sync with what Heidegger unearths or lays out in Being and Time. Also, just one more thing about this idea of original sin, that it is, I remember last time in one of our conversations, I was talking with Walter about the value of the term phenomenology in the present day. And I suggested that it has really lost any technical significance or meaning, and it has come down to us with the general sense of a description, of a very careful description of a situation or an experience. So in that sense, the word phenomenological, or the word phenomenology remains of value for us, right? Because we could say that what the old Christian philosophers and theologians were doing were laying out a phenomenological account of the problematic human situation we find ourselves in. So, there's still room. And some people ask me, should we banish the word phenomenology or phenomenological from our vocabulary? No, I've never suggested that at all. What I'm saying, though, is that the word has come into the vernacular. It's come into the general academic vocabulary to simply refer to a description, a descriptive account of an experience we have or of a situation that we encounter. And that would be perfectly appropriate in this case to refer to something like the term original sin as a phenomenological account of the human situation, very much as Nietzsche's account of the eternal wound of existence. Well, what I have suggested is that if we read Being and Time, we have this sense that Heidegger himself was giving now a phenomenological rendering of what Nietzsche had called the eternal wound of existence. Being and Time is a very, and again, this requires so much more discussion and conversation, but Being and Time is too often looked at as the final word, the only word, the final word of what Heidegger has to say about things. And that's quite unfortunate. Now, that might be particularly the case in the English-speaking Heidegger scholarship, perhaps not so in other traditions of commentary. We could talk more about that. But in Being and Time, what we can say is that all of this interesting background that Alfred is offering us and providing us with seems to be absent, oddly enough. And what we find here is Heidegger, who's really concerned with laying out in great detail our thrownness and facticity. That is, all the ways that our existence is bounded and bound up. We're reminded, too, of his description of the human situation. The word he uses, care, right? I mean, our existence is structured by care, an encumbrance, it's trammel. Now, of course, he always says, I'm not talking about this ontically. I'm not talking about any particular ways in which the human being is trammeled or encumbered, or it has to experience the difficulty of existing. But nonetheless, he says this is an existential, right? This is an ontological component of Dasein, of the human being. So this Heidegger of Being and Time, like Nietzsche, calls on us, right? He calls on us to take up this radical finitude resolutely, right? In Chaucer, resolutely. Perhaps not with Nietzschean heroism, but resolutely nonetheless. And for Heidegger, reading Being and Time, you have this sense there's no denying, right, our fractured existence, no hiding from it, no covering it over, no escaping the illusions of the masses. And the call is to live authentically by resolutely accepting this wounded existence. Now, what I want to just highlight briefly is that if we are only reading Being and Time, we first of all don't get the fuller sense of Heidegger's background, especially what Alfred is calling to mind for us or bringing to light for us. And we also note then a dramatic difference in what the later Heidegger wishes to highlight and illuminate. And these significant differences between Heidegger of being in time and later Heidegger, I've highlighted many times in my own work. There are significant differences in theme, tenor, and tone, and this is a very good example of it. Let's get to the crux of the matter here. For the later Heidegger, after being in time, and I would say especially from the 1940s onward, the central issue for us human beings, for Heidegger, is no longer simply the pain of the wound of existence, our thrownness, our facticity, that we are care. But rather now, what comes into view is Heidegger's concern with what heals us, what saves us from this trammeled existence. And his suggestion is always that what heals us is our homecoming to being, right? This Heimkehr, Heimkunft, this homecoming to being. So thrownness and facticity and care is no longer the final word on our existence. And not because these are negated or eliminated, but because they are taken up into the wholeness of our existence. They are taken up into the holy, being as the holy. And I just want to make a quick note here, and we could talk more about it, but as Alfred was reading those excerpts, you see the younger Heidegger leading up to being in time in some ways indelibly marked, right, by the mystery of his experiences in the Archabbey, the mystery of the High Mass, the mystery of the canonical hours that the monks exercised each day. But we also find in the early Heidegger a kind of fascination with the dark, with the night. And Alfred pointed that out very well. And so you see there are two things going on with Heidegger in those early years. This fascination and this love of the beauty and the mystery of the religiosity of the Catholic tradition, but at the same time, as a younger thinker, he's focused on the Compline, right? That's the last prayer of the evening. That's the dark prayer. That's the prayer that moves us into death, the death of the night. So you see this coming as well, so that when we get to being in time, there should be no surprise, right? Because he's on to that thread. But it's the other thread, it's the other seed that flowers in the later work. That thread of the opening to grace that heals and saves. Now, I don't want to go over time here, but just a few more things to talk about here. Because I think that in the later work, this is so very evident, especially in his readings of Trockel. Now, Heidegger was fully aware of the excruciating pain of Trockel's personal life. But at the same time now, so I'm talking about the years 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, he saw glimmers of a saving transcendence in Trockel's poetry. So later Heidegger's message is not the same as the message of being in time, that we must simply take up our broken existence authentically and resolutely. which in a way is really just a variation on Nietzsche's teaching. Rather, in the later Heidegger, the core message is strikingly different. He calls on us to humbly recognize that the pain of human existence, as exemplified by Trockel's own tragic life, is taken up and transformed in the light of the experience of being itself. Being is the holy that makes us whole. Being as the holy appeals to us, reaches out to us to offer us a saving grace, he says. And I'll just quote one line. This is from Heidegger's commentary on Trockel's poem, A Winter Evening. And this is from the 1950 lecture, Die Sprache, Language. And here, and again, I'll just pull out couple of lines. After talking about the pain of Trockel's wandering, he's a wanderer. In some way, we're all wandering. But then he says, there's this transformative line. Golden blooms the tree of graces. It's from Trockel's poetry, right? Golden blüht der Baum der Gnaden. And then, right, he says that Trockel's poem opens up to the blooming that opens itself to heaven's blessing. So a spiritual transformation has come upon us. And this blessing is a kind of joyful happening, Heidegger says, right? I would say it's an ereignis. It's this transformative ereignis. But it's one that we haven't earned, he says. We haven't earned. It's not merited. It comes to us as a gift. And he emphasizes this in a beautiful line. He says, the poem, this is Heidegger speaking now, the poem names the tree of graces. Its pure blossoming bears the fruit that falls to us undeservedly. Undeservedly. The saving holy, das rettend Heilige, which is favorably disposed toward the mortals. The German is das den Sterblichen hold ist. Now, I've translated that as the saving holy, which is favorably disposed toward the mortals. But it could also be translated as the saving holy, which is graciously disposed toward the mortals. Notice Heidegger's language here. I don't think it's accidental when he says, dass den Sterblichen hold ist. Hold ist, hold, so close to hult. Hult, this other German word with Gnade, for grace. Hult ist hult. That's the resonance there of the grace that Alfred was talking about in the early Heidegger. So again, I'm not suggesting, and some people perhaps misunderstand me here. I am never claiming that Heidegger is a Christian thinker or that Heidegger is a Catholic thinker. That's not the point. The point is rather that in this language that we find in the later Heidegger, we hear echoes of that indelible impression that the younger Heidegger had and was so excited about and fascinated by and mesmerized by and taken with, right? And that he describes so beautifully in the letters to Brockman in the other passages that Alfred wrote about. And so we hear an echo, right, of, and it need not even be specifically Christian or Catholic. I think it is here, but it is in some fashion religious, spiritual, that in the later Heidegger here, it is not something that we're doing. It's not merited. It's not any kind of willful action on our part that's going to save us, but rather an openness to the gift of the saving holy. That's quite beautiful. It's stunningly beautiful. Unless, of course, one is a Nietzschean and insists that, right, that the wound of existence is all there is, and we're just going to have to deal with that with resolution or even with heroism, right? And I think there is that in the early Heidegger, in Being in Time, but it is not there as clearly, as decisively in later Heidegger. And in later Heidegger, we see, we're witnessing Heidegger's retrieval of his own transport. He was transported in these experiences at the Abbey, and the seeds there put aside, they weren't watered as he's working up toward Being in Time, but certainly beginning with his reflections, I think, on Hölderlin in the early 40s. Now they come to flower, 40s, 50s, 60s, right to the end. Okay, I'll leave it there. And Alfred,
Yeah,
back to you.
Much for your meditative presentation. Let's put it that way. Maybe I'll start with a question myself for once.
Good.
I think that Heidegger would not speak about an eternal wound of existence, but of a temporal wound of existence.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Alfred. And I think Nietzsche's phrase, though, I think is simply meant to say that it's not going away. There's no cure for the human condition. So I wouldn't understand it, in terms of a time or no time, but rather it's just Nietzsche's typical way of, he's not just going to make the point; he's going to punch you in the face with it. It's not going away. It is an indelible mark of human existence.
That you can relate to Being Towards Death and Being in Time and Being Mortal in his later work. I think that's the wound of existence, this mortality that we are faced with. And let's say Heidegger Being in Time is a different answer than the Heidegger who starts from Gelassenheit in his later
Yes,
work.
that's right.
In Being in Time, he says that the Grundbefindlichkeit, the fundamental disposition of Dasein, is anxiety, angst. And he corrects that in his famous lecture course on the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, where he has this long description or phenomenological disclosure of boredom. And then he comes up with this notion of fundamental attunements. So anxiety becomes a fundamental attunement. Boredom is another one. But things like awe, wonder, love are also fundamental attunements. So in his later work, he's more receptive, I think, to that. There is something, maybe it's the gift of being, that If you think of it in the German terms as Huld, which is two possible, in German you have two words. When you say in English grace, it can be Gnade or mercy. And you have the German Huld, which is more like grace itself. It's something that's happens, that's there, that we cannot produce, cannot make happen. It's a gift in that sense.
Yes.
Something that Heidegger in his later work is more receptive to and trying to bring up.
And I think though you very, very effectively point out though that there are these passages in this young Heidegger that point the way, so that we can at least continue to find the thread or follow the thread. And I would mention that in my very first book, I have a chapter from angst to astonishment. That was one of the most striking things for me as a younger scholar that I had to write about, because Alfred, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's this very remarkable development in his thinking about the place and the role of angst, and it certainly is superseded by this sense of wonder, awe, astonishment, and in a way returns to the ancient Greek thinkers and this idea of thaumazein, wonder before all that is. I have a question for you, Alfred. In your research here, how particular did Heidegger, or let me put it this way, when Heidegger visited the Abbey, did he participate in all the activities of the Abbey?
Well, of course, he was allowed to stay in the cloister, so with the monks, like Guardini describes his own visit. Nowadays, it's no longer possible. But that means he didn't get the robes, so he would have to go in civilian clothes about the business. And he writes a letter to Elfriede where he refers to this and says, well, I would much rather be dressed like the monks, so to be an integral part of it. So where they were working, he would be writing and reading in his own cell, and then participate in all the religious ceremonies during the day, and live in this same rhythm. I think that's something that has been, for Heidegger, an important way of learning how to live your life, which allowed him to produce as much as he did. Because he had a very strict daily order imposed also on him by his wife, Elfriede. But most people don't know is that Heidegger used to stay up very late and smoke a lot before we met Elfriede. And she said, well, Martin, if you want to become somebody, this is no good. You have to change your life. You get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, you have your breakfast, and then you can work for a couple of hours, etc., etc. And you have to stop smoking. And Heidegger always had problems sleeping. Which seems natural if you're thinking like he did, basically the whole day. How do you turn it off? And as he says also in his little book, Aus der freien Distinctions, we don't come to thoughts, thoughts come to us, which is also this moment of grace. And
yes.
In his own experience already as a child, when he was, his father was the sexton of the church, which meant that they, on Christmas morning, when it was still completely dark, there were no street lights. These boys would gather at the house of the sexton right opposite the church, and they would go out after having some coffee and cake to go to the church, either to assist his father in the preparation of the service, and some of the boys were the guys who rang the bells. And ringing church bells in those days was really important, and it's difficult. It's not automatic as it is nowadays. And I think so. There was a wonder. There was something over it. He also speaks about in this little text on the mystery of the bell tower, how it just gives a meaning to life. His mother always liked to say, "Well, life is so beautifully arranged. There's always something to look forward to." Which is also this gracious way of life. Of course, he gets very critical about the Catholic system, most of all, and later than the Protestant system, which is also trying to capture lived experience, living faith into a kind of dogmatic structure.
Yes.
Something
Yes.
that he rejects completely and keeps
Yes.
rejecting his whole life. But this lived experience, also the monks who devote their lives to the service of God, Christ, and spend their lives singing prayers, worshipping God, also on behalf of the rest of humanity, of course. It's not an individuated thing. It's part of the whole, let's say, medieval worldview, which in a sense is still alive in monasteries today.
Right. And I think, and I certainly want to be able to get to all of your questions, but I think that is what really attracted him. I mean, if we look at it in retrospect, what really attracted him to Husserl's thinking was not the transcendental phenomenological apparatus that Husserl had set up, but rather what I think Heidegger took away was, oh my goodness, it's the experience here that needs to be uh, uh, given an account of. It's the religious experience that intrigues me, and this is how Husserl's phenomenology, I think, the descriptive character, came to play a large role in the early Heidegger's thinking, but not the mechanics. None of that seemed to be of interest to Heidegger, and certainly he drops that very quickly. But it was that appeal to the descriptive account of religious experience. Of course, that was, you mentioned Romano Guardini. I mean, Guardini was enthralled with what Heidegger was doing here, right? I mean, this idea that it is not just dogma, doctrine, ritual, liturgy. Guardini said, Heidegger has taught me to try to express to the faithful what that experience is. And he worked very hard to transform Catholic teaching. Not that he succeeded necessarily, but he certainly was involved in that movement. And he thought that this was one of the great contributions of Heidegger's phenomenological account. But of course, Guardini didn't think it was incompatible with metaphysics. I mean, there would be no reason to think it's incompatible with metaphysics, because you are giving a lived experience. You're giving an account of a lived experience of what is, and what is certainly what metaphysics is concerned with. So there's no necessary incompatibility there at all.
I think you could say for Heidegger, the different ways of putting it. I would say the starting point is lived experience as such. That's where you start from. That's the thrownness that you can't get away from. You can also say, as he does in Being and Time, that he starts from understanding of being. There is understanding of being, and then you can ask two different questions, which also play a role in Being and Time. What is an understanding of being? So you do a phenomenology, or try to do one, and then you disclose this whole structure of Dasein and how that makes it possible to have an understanding of being. And you can ask the question, how is it possible? Which is the transcendental moment in Being and Time, in my opinion, that they conflict in Being and Time at several points, and you can point them out if you like. But it's in his later thinking, which he already uses It's also interesting, in 1915, he wrote a small text for the local newspaper. The Catholic Church had asked the believers to spend 3 days of reflection, Besinnung, on the war in 1915. And Heidegger wrote a small report about it for the local newspaper. And there he talks about Besinnung for the first time. Besinnung as going after the sense of, are we afraid of Besinnung in our time? And he would say, yes, we are afraid of really thinking things through. It's similar to what he says in Was heißt Denker, in what's called thinking. Das Bedenklichste unserer bedenkliche Zeit ist, dass wir immer noch nicht denken. So the most questionable, at the same time thought worthy in our time, is that we still are not thinking. We're still afraid to think. And that's and that later he uses the famous Esquipte, which he also already mentions in Being and Time, in which place he discusses at length on time and being. This Esquipte, that's also the moment of facticity where you cannot get before. Heidegger, it's in my opinion, but that doesn't exclude that there is we are related to the holy, to the infinite, if you want.
Yes, no, Alfred, I think you and I agree very much on these kinds of matters. I mean, I don't even think it's a disagreement. It's just that I don't see Heidegger continuing to value, right, the terminology in Being and Time. It has a different resonance. Thrownness, facticity, care. It has a different. It has a resonance that he is not as concerned with in the later work. He wants a different language. He wants a poetic language that's going to take up the concerns that he now has. And of course, this is the genius of Heidegger, though, right? I mean, because he never feels confined to any particular language or any particular terminology. He's constantly looking for new language to say what, is given, or to say what, we are open to in our experience of being. So there's a fluidity, there's a beautiful fluidity in Heidegger's thinking, but also in his language. So
that has to do with the fact that he uses formal indication and no concepts. So the formal indication points you.
I didn't hear that.
The formal indication uses instead of concepts. That's one of the misreadings of Heidegger that happens a lot. And people try to explain his terminology as concepts, but they point you to the experience where you may find it in your own existence. But it means to be alive, to be a human being, to be to be in the world, to encounter things is something you can only experience in your own existence. You cannot do it from an objective standpoint, theoretical, like Jaspers does basically in the psychology of worldviews. He's looking at the stage of life where the things are unfolding, and he gives then a list of possible reactions you can have in specific limit situations. So there's and I think there's no need to stick to the terminology. It's like Wittgenstein's ladder that you need to climb the wall so you can look over it, but then you don't need it anymore. And he's constantly reflecting also Besinnung on the terminology he uses. And his way, I think from the start to the end, Heidegger is doing phenomenology, although he doesn't call it phenomenology, basically pretty soon after Being in Time. It has to do with, for Heidegger, the most important thing he learned from Husserl was how to do phenomenology. They would work in 1918, they would work for hours, a couple of days a week, and he would see how Husserl did phenomenology. And similar to when you want to become an artist, you go study who is a master of the art. So you go to somebody you hold in high esteem as a painter, for example, and become an apprentice. And that's what Heidegger went through with Husserl, and that's his eternal gratitude, basically, to Husserl, that he never gives up, although he's criticizing Husserl for the way he's developing phenomenology into a transcendental philosophy. But I think and that's what he did with his students, trying to make them
Yes.
see. And you can only learn it by watching somebody do it. You cannot teach it. I think that's the big difference between Heidegger's lecture courses, seminars, and those of his contemporaries. He's trying to make you see by looking with him at things.
That's exactly what when I took several seminars with Gadamer many years ago. That's exactly what Gadamer reported, that the lecture hall was electric, when Heidegger was speaking, because he was bringing this alive. It was the experience that mattered in philosophizing. And Gadamer said many times that this was very new, because the typical fashion or the typical manner was to lay things out objectively. And no doubt Heidegger, when he says he has a quarrel or he's opposed to metaphysics, I mean, this is the kind of metaphysics he's fighting against, this kind of the dead objective presentation of positions, instead of trying to understand the inner springs of a philosophical position, right? And that seems to always be his motivating factor, his motivation. Yes, that's right.
Well, I'm gonna shut up for now. Invite other people to say something or have a comment, question, whatever.
Well, good. Yes.
Oh, it's also clear. Yes.
If no one else is going to go, I'll throw a proposal for thought and response. When Richard was talking about the wound of existence and evil and the night, I got thinking that in the later thought, these he possibly and not necessarily consciously spins these and subsumes these in a positive light. So night becomes the Nacht, the nothing, and evil becomes the Gestell. Question. There's a question mark.
Oh, there's a question.
I'm not laying the claim. It's a thought that crossed my mind.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting thought, Michael. Well, Alfred, perhaps you have a thought before I do. I want to formulate something thoughtful for you, Michael.
Well, I'll just start talking and then see where it goes.
Well, it seems to me that certainly the passages that Alfred read, I mean, here you have a young man who is, again, there seems to be two competing powerful forces at work, right? I mean, there's this fascination, this love, this encounter with the beauty and the transcendence and the mystery of these Catholic traditions. And yet at the same time, there seems to be an incipient preoccupation with the night and with the dark and with evil, and the Compline again, that the last of the liturgical hours. And so I think that Heidegger was fully aware of the difficulty, the wound of existence, and he works this out in his own way in Being and Time. But Michael, your suggestion is that perhaps that wound looks a little bit different in the later work, because now it seems to center on, in particular, das Gestell and the ways in which the modern scientific technological world is encumbering us in a new way, right? And that this is a struggle that we have as human beings. And yet he holds out the hope and the promise that there is some release from that frame or from that prison that we might find ourselves in the contemporary world. So I would say that that's an interesting line of thought to pursue. To what extent does the later Heidegger find the wound taking on a different shape or a different form, or a particularly striking example of how we are trammeled and encumbered in the modern and contemporary world.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll say a few words as well. I think already with this notion of the night, you should always remember that the night is still a clearing. There are things that are only visible at night, like the stars, for example. So that's why Heidegger likes to keep them separated, that you don't turn the night into day, so you can no longer see the stars because of the city lights. But this experience of night and the changing of the season and things he talks about are for Heidegger fundamental to our way of existence, let's put it that way. And the big difference, I think, between the earlier Heidegger up to basically his political involvement and the Heidegger from the contributions to philosophy on is that he begins to develop both his own understanding of the history of metaphysics as this succession of fundamental metaphysical positions, which you cannot derive from each other, but as fundamental metaphysical positions have to contradict each other, because each thinks they are giving the true interpretation of reality as something independent of us. But I can say more about that. And the other element he's developing is the issue of being. And that's why this notion of doing a fundamental ontology that he has in Being and Time still as a kind of goal for the whole project disappears. It makes no sense to do a fundamental ontology. Being has a history. Then there's always something that being has already been and something that being may still become. And that's where this notion of arikeness comes to play such a central role. The arikeness is I like to call it nowadays, the sameness of being, thinking, and language is an arikeness that happens differently in history. It's a historical thing. So the dress of being that we are now still caught up in is the dress of being as metaphysics. And if that's Heidegger's big problem, then how can you get away from metaphysics? For him, completion of metaphysics, or the end of metaphysics is Hegel's system, as the completion of Platonism. And that leaves this possibility for Nietzsche to turn it upside down, which is then the completion of metaphysics. And that's why he has this famous lecture, The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking. So metaphysics and philosophy become identical for Heidegger, basically. And then you have But you cannot simply step out of metaphysics as Ernst Jünger thought, for example. Because when you step out, you need a different language. If you still speak the same language you did within metaphysics, if you step out of metaphysics, you're just taking your metaphysics with you. And that's why he spends so much time and he's trying to, in many different ways, to first of all bring us to an experience of the limit of metaphysical thinking. So it shows up the possibility of another kind of thinking. And he's trying to show the possibility of it in this poetizing thinking that he develops, let's say, in the 50s, which you find in a lot of these famous essays from that time. And he keeps rethinking, retrying. That's why he starts using also these different ways of writing. Being in Time is basically still a philosophical treatise written for an audience that Heidegger knew beforehand, which was the Minister of Education in Berlin. And he knew that he would send his manuscript or this book to the most famous philosophers of his day and ask their opinion about the book, if it was really proof that Heidegger was an original thinker and that he would be deserving to get a chair of philosophy at the University of Marburg. That explains for a part the way it's written. And you also should keep in mind that it was written in 6 months. He started writing Being in Time in March 1926. And already in October, he got the first proofs from the printer. He was writing Being in Time as the first proofs were arriving. So he never had a chance to think it through. When he was with Jaspers in early 1927, he took the decision not to continue with writing the third division. He had worked out manuscript third division that he discussed with Jaspers, and they came to the conclusion that it didn't work, it wasn't good enough. And then he told the printer, you can stop printing when you have the second division, and then I'm going to take a break. And he thought within a year, maybe 2 years, I can rewrite the third division and then finish the first part. The second part would have been easier because he had this enormous amount of lecture course material that he could use to transform it into the second part of Being in Time. This struggle with language, that's why Heidegger is so going to such pains to try and find something non-metaphysical. Of course, it opens up two possibilities. One is to go back to early Greek thinking, which is pre-metaphysical, like Anaximander, Parmenides, and Heraclitus. The other possibility is poetry at the end, at least through metaphysics. So he's hoping to find something in Hölderlin, Twargel, George, all these poets, Rilke, that he's interpreting, that may be a non-metaphysical language. And that's what I think he achieves it in some of his writings. I think you have this famous, we did a webinar on it, this 10 meanings of Ereignis in Das Ereignis, the event. When you read it, basically you cannot understand it, because if you understand it, you're going to reinterpret it in metaphysical language. So you have to listen to it, and it speaks. At a certain point, you begin to hear something, but you cannot say what you're hearing, because if you transform it back into metaphysics. But it gives you a feeling for what he's trying to do. That's why he also says, I'm just preparing for another kind of thinking, so that not only calculative thinking and framing and standing reserve will be the end of the human being, basically.
And my only qualification in this friendly Auseinandersetzung here with Alfred and all of you is, as you all know, I'm always uncomfortable with any sharp distinction, though, between metaphysics and Heidegger's thinking, only for this reason. Think about, for example, es gibt. The S
Yeah.
in Es gibt is beyond history. The S is not itself a historical phenomenon. So when we think, as Heidegger says, of being itself, or when we are brought to think of the S, the it that gives, our thinking is moved beyond any kind of historical thinking. The it is what gives all of these historical epics, perhaps, but is itself not conditioned by history and language in the same way. So that itself is a metaphysical speculation. So Heidegger is not beyond metaphysical speculation himself. It's that it takes a very different form from traditional metaphysical accounts, and especially the ones he's most opposed to, and that's the metaphysics of substance or the metaphysics of subject. But as we discussed earlier, especially with Walter, Heidegger wasn't the only one fiercely opposed to the metaphysics of substance. I mean, Alfred North Whitehead was as well. And so there are other metaphysicians who would agree with Heidegger that we can't necessarily proceed with the metaphysics of substance or of subject, but that doesn't mean that we have left behind all metaphysical thinking. And that's true in Heidegger as well. In his reflections on Es gibt, it takes on the character of a metaphysical speculation precisely because the Es, the it, is beyond history.
Walter, you want to go first?
Thank you. Let me bring this down. Thank you. I was struck very much, and listening to both of you and Richard's presentation, in my mind, with a perception. It's been a growing perception for a long time in my mind about the relationship or similarity between Heidegger and this group that we don't mention a lot, and that is the Catholic mystics. You know, not the Catholic clergy and, you know, liturgists and all that, but the Catholic mystics. You know, and there's a whole from modern times going all the way back. And I know Heidegger was very familiar with particularly the medieval mystics, and he was not. And it struck me, and it's always struck me about a relationship between, you know, the similarity between what the mystics were saying, though being quote unquote Catholic mystics or quote unquote saints, their mysticism is grounded in the metaphysical language in the dogmatic language of the church that it flowers out of. So it's sort of imbued with that language, but it seems to me to be so similar. The experience they're describing, and in fact, it reminds me of, you know, a number of, which I know you all are aware of, but a number of them that were called into question, were called before an inquisition, you know, to say, well, what are you saying? What are you saying? Teresa of Avila, her writings and sayings had to go before the Inquisition. Padre Pio in modern times was sanctioned and couldn't even say mass for 10 years or whatever. And so there's even within the church, there seems to be this conflict. I don't know if conflict's the right word, but just this dynamic between the metaphysics and the dogma of the church and that which, to me, Heidegger talks about, but you see it blossoming within the church through the mystics, and that it creates this dynamic, sometimes conflict, within the church. And so I guess my final comment would, I'm just making that observation for you to see if I make any sense at all. But the final observation would be that that's one thing that I think is so brilliant about Heidegger, is that whatever it is, he seems to be bringing, like no one I've ever witnessed that's not a mystic, though I think he probably was a mystic in his own way, but he's bringing this to the world in general, philosophy, in just in a very unique way. You know, how does everyone think about this notion? Because a lot of times I say we, perhaps it's just me, tend to think there's the church and dogma and all that, and then there happen to be, for some reason, these people that just go way out there, you know, and here they are, the mystics, but they must just be people that we can't, you know, think like them. And Heidegger is, to me, seems to be someone who's saying, let's think this through a little bit. So there is something that's shared. Does any of that make any sense?
Walter, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's this long tradition in the Catholic tradition. I mean, the pseudo-Dionysus, the Neoplatonic Christian thinkers and mystics. Certainly, Heidegger understood fully the implications of Eckhart's moving beyond the figure of God to the mysterious, the utterly mysterious and unnameable Godhead. I think you're absolutely right. And I think he's picking up on that tradition, or he's trying to amplify that tradition. And to me, one of the most remarkable things in the contemporary Catholic setting, I mean, I happen to teach at a Catholic college, it's completely lost. I talked to a few clerics. They have no clue about this tradition whatsoever. They are completely preoccupied with cultural, social, economic, political issues or ethical issues, or that objective church history that Alfred was talking about. But what a loss, really! And this is one of the great contributions I think that Heidegger has made to those who are interested in a religious or spiritual thinking that is not simply the history of dogma and doctrine. And it's a rich, long tradition that he's amplifying. I agree with you completely about that in his own way, but which it seems to have been completely lost in the contemporary Catholic setting. It disappoints me terribly that it could be, well, one would hope only temporarily lost, but it is most certainly not in the minds of those who are teaching at Catholic colleges today.
For my 2 cents or 5 cents, you can decide afterwards. You have to remember that Heidegger was planning to join the Jesuit order. And that's why I moved to Austria, because the order was forbidden in Germany. There was no place to go. And as a novice, he had to do the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. And he also had to do them when he was later as a student of theology in Freiburg, in Collegium Borromeanum. They would ask the students also to do these spiritual exercises. And of course, he had a pretty good understanding of mystic tradition. He planned to do a lecture course on it, as you probably know. And you find a lot of the authors that you mentioned in his notes that he prepared for doing the course. So he's talking about Teresa of Avila, he's talking about Bernard of Clairvaux. He's talking, of course, Meister Eckhart is somebody he read from as a schoolboy, basically, already. He also, Heinrich von Suso was another mystic, who lived in Constance. So he knew about these traditions, certainly. And I think that you have to make a distinction, I think. And for Heidegger, a fundamental metaphysical position is not something you can be opposed to. It's a response to an address of being. And in the metaphysician who works out this answer to the address, it's a living thinking. It's only after when the students get a hold of it, they turn it in some kind of fixed doctrine. There's a difference between Descartes as a thinker and Cartesianism. There's a difference between Hegel as a thinker and Hegelianism, not to talk about the neo-forms of those traditions. So, for me, of course, Rich is right. The escaped is for Heidegger the biggest mystery, the wonder that there is something. And that's also the limitation. It's what Schelling calls das Unvordenkliche. It's that for which you cannot think anything else. That's our finitude. We can accept graciously the gift of this mystery that it gives something, but we will never be able to explain it, to understand it. Yes, if I say it correctly.
My name is Kang Kyung-hoon from South Korea. Heidegger is Catholic or not is not matter because his basis is on his things, and only God and Heidegger just knew his space. So my point is, it's something different. Everyone has one living experience in their lives. So we in Korean words in that say it says physical experience 체험. So I believe the difference between British empirism and phenomenology is accepting physical experience or not. So how can I explain the difference between British empirism and phenomenology or hermeneutics? Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
I don't think I got the question exactly.
The difference, Kang, is it Kang?
Yeah.
Yes,
The difference between what and what?
British empirism.
British empiricism.
Empiricism, yes. Sorry,
British
my wrong
empiricism.
pronunciation. Yeah.
No, that's okay. That's okay. British empiricism and
Phenomenology or hermeneutics.
okay.
British empiricism and hermeneutics.
In Korean language, we say physical experience.
Empirical experience.
Physical experience, yes.
Empirical experience, yes.
Empirical experience.
Yes. Well, I mean, they're worlds apart, really. I mean, the British empiricists were concerned with how we can understand the world through the senses. And there's a whole corollary of positions that really don't intersect with Heidegger's concerns as such. But what's interesting is that I suppose empiricism remains a philosophical position that is taught at many universities and colleges and in many philosophy departments. And I'm not surprised that you're studying the empiricists. I mean, especially if these departments are also concerned with the scientific methodology.
Yes.
Yes, right. So that is for a whole nother weekend
Yeah.
to talk about Heidegger and science and those monumental issues. All I can say, Kang, is thank you for your question, but all I could say is that there are so many layers to your question that it would take quite some time to sort all of the issues out.
Mm.
Any
Okay, thank you
other-
for your answer.
Any other questions, comments, requests? Yes.
Thank you, both of you, for the wonderful presentation. I was wondering about something, and I was just thinking whether I should raise it or not. I was thinking about negative theology and how I find and maybe the need to separate maybe the subtle distinction between what we call mysticism and negative theology, where the theologian uses negative language for affirming God's existence or something about God. And I was thinking when we look at Heidegger and his language, which includes both darkness and light, let's say, both facticity and the attempt to sort of go beyond facticity. I was wondering if negative theology, the history of negative theology, could be also included in the discussion, because in a way, this negative language is also for the negative theologian a sort of positive affirmation. And I was also thinking about a chapter in Professor Capobianco's last to last book, which has been very inspirational to me, which is on Rumi, where he talks about language and its limitations, but also at the same time it's the fact that we can't avoid language, but we have to use language, but then we have to show how language is limited. I mean, all these questions, were crowding in my mind when I was looking at Heidegger's own struggles with these, to put it in simple words, positive and negative possibilities when thinking about these questions. So I was wondering about the negative theologians and the history of negative theology, and if that conversation is being had in Heidegger scholarship, in distinction from the broad group that we name mystics or mysticism. And Professor Capobianco just mentioned Pseudo-Dionysius, and maybe we can think about Nicholas of Cusa, and other negative theologians in the Western tradition, and how we can maybe think about these questions in conversation with those thinkers in that history. This was something that I was thinking about when both of you were giving us those excellent presentations.
Bharatwaj, thank you so much. I know you're thinking about these things, and I enjoy exchanging thoughts and ideas with you. I think there's no question that Heidegger was much more comfortable with that apophatic tradition, the via negativa, than he was with the cataphatic tradition, which was the more Thomistic tradition of being able to name God in certain ways, in a positive way. And I mean, this was part of his discomfort with scholastic philosophy, with Thomistic philosophy. In particular, Jude and I have been talking about this a little bit. I mean, Heidegger goes so far as to say, right, when we're talking about the divine, he says, now again, not God, because he wants to let go of that word because he feels that belongs to the cataphatic tradition of metaphysical theology. But he says when we talk about the divine, we can't even claim that the principle of non-contradiction holds. Heidegger is clear that he wants to move beyond the Aristotelian Thomistic canon that says that in speaking about God, we must uphold or affirm the principle of non-contradiction, that the laws of logic apply also to God, to the divine. And Heidegger says, no, I don't accept that. That is a domestication of the divine in a way that he's not willing to accept. And that's completely at home in that apophatic tradition that you mentioned, going back, oh my goodness, certainly to the pseudo-Dionysus, but many others, and through the Middle Ages and into the present. So that's one of the a good distinguishing marks between Heidegger's approach here to the divine and the approach that would be more positive, as exemplified, let's say, in Thomas Aquinas. In fact, Heidegger says that there's something more mysterious about Augustine's God than there is about Thomas's God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point too, the distinction between Augustine's and Aquinas' God. Yeah, I also feel that the negative theologians try to stretch the possibility, try to see the limits of language in a very interesting way, to see to the extent to which language can be sort of stretched. And so I think that that's also a very interesting enterprise of Heidegger's, in my opinion. So when Professor Denker was mentioning how Heidegger looks at the metaphysical tradition to see to what extent the sort of the language of metaphysics can still be employed, and if we go out of metaphysics, what is the language that we will carry out of metaphysics? And of course, your argument there would be, are we actually ever going to escape metaphysics? So it's all this discussion. I was reminded of the negative theologians, because in a way they are not doing theology, but isn't it still theology? And those kinds of complicated discussions.
Yes.
But yeah.
No, I think, it's clear that Heidegger wants to jump out of a particular kind of metaphysics, but really, in the end, he jumps into another kind. And it is of the kind that is not without precedent in not just the history of Western thinking, but certainly in many Eastern traditions as well. So there's, many Eastern traditions.
Just not to take up too much, but and the history of negative theology we should also keep in mind the Jewish and the Islamic negative theologians in the sort of the Western tradition. I think that it's to which you also invite us. So okay. So thank you.
Thank you.
Jude has been waiting.
Oh, thanks, Alfred and Richard. Thank you for your talks. Really helpful, and it's always interesting to hear about the later and earlier Heidegger. what struck me as especially interesting is that even though Heidegger was, shall we say, not very pleased with the institutional church, he was able to sort of locate a spirituality of grace, as it were, or a kind of spirituality of healing outside of the church, but in perhaps in nature or in a different space, a different location. And I thought it's very interesting because what happened was that, well, this is a bit of a story at home, but my wife recently went on the Camino, and of course she went to the church, and the priest was there, and then every day they had mass and all that. But it wasn't just the mass and the official liturgy that she drew on for nourishment. I think, if anything, listening to her describe her experience is actually more of the journey, the walk outside of the liturgical experience. And of course, there were all kinds of people there, non-Catholics as well. I've got friends who've left the church and all whatnot. And it's a very Heideggerian thing, it seems to me. When they're on that journey, it's not about anything about, it's not so much the Catholic liturgy or grace understood in the theological scholastic sense, but a kind of different experience. And I wanted to ask whether you had anything to say to that, whether you think. And the other thing I thought it was interesting, of course, it's just a coincidence because we like to think about Heidegger's way of being, and of course, the Camino is also in a way in Spanish. Well, just a few thoughts. Thank you very much.
Yes, I don't want to jump in again, Alfred. You please, but I just wanted to mention to Jude, your point again is well taken. It's similar to what we were talking about with Walter and Bharadwaj, and that is that where did you go, Jude? Oh, there you are. Okay, that there are these resources in the Catholic Christian tradition. I mean, the centuries of talk about pilgrimage, journey, the whole idea of life as a journey. I mean, these resources are there, but they need to be retrieved in the contemporary world, right? And they maybe can be retrieved in a Heideggerian way, as you're suggesting, but they need to be retrieved because, I don't want to endorse Heidegger's critique of a contemporary world fully because, I think sometimes it is overdrawn and overdone, but one can't help but think that in our contemporary world, the space in which we live, the interior space, the psychic space in which we live is shrinking ever more rapidly. And the room to talk about the journey, the pilgrimage, the path of life, there's very, very little room for that. And this is true, as I said, not only at colleges and universities, but even in seminaries and in church settings. These are not the things that are being talked about, but I would completely agree with you that these marvelous resources in the Catholic tradition need to be retrieved and expressed and conveyed. And as you're doing, Jude, you're trying to marry these to what Heidegger is saying, and I think that's precisely what we need more of.
I think the journey you're
Thank you.
Is the whole experience. It's both the experience of being at Mass or being with the priest, but it's also the experience of traveling, of going somewhere, meeting people you've never seen in your life. I have a friend who had a lot of business problems, and he was in his 50s and he didn't know really where to turn now. and he decided to walk from Mesquite to Santiago, which takes you 3 months. Of course, interesting enough, Boiron is one of the stations you go through if you go to Santiago. And he just wanted to be with himself in a way. But at the same time, being on that journey, you meet the other pilgrims and you have encounters and you sleep in houses with other pilgrims, you have meals together, you stick around for a couple of days with the same people. There are Americans there are Chinese there, from all over the world. And it gave him the same new insight into his life and what he wanted to do in his life. I think we can discuss how much of it is Catholic and how much of it is a sort of grace in a maybe more Heideggerian sense in that way. And of course, Heidegger himself always talks about his ways and not his works. He's on a path of thinking. His path of thinking is basically a relentless questioning. Every time he gets somewhere, he's going to question his answer. That's why there is no Heideggerian philosophy.
Yes. Thank you, Alfred and Richard. Thank you very much.
Well, Ken, you have another?
Yes. In my opinion, Mr. Denker insisted Heidegger was staying in Catholic tradition. Mr. Capobianco insisted that the later Heidegger is different from early Heidegger and young Heidegger. As an East Asian, I want to ask to Mr. Capobianco. Everyone knows Taoism, and Taoism is East Asian teaching. So many Korean Heidegger masters said that the later Heidegger is close and related to East Asian teaching like Taoism, Buddhism, and so many East Asian teachings. So in Taoism, in the truth that the named is not truth, the name that named is not truth, not real name. The nature should imitate the truth shouldn't imitate the nature or nature. And this is Taoism teaching. How do you think about the relationship between later Heidegger and Taoism? I want to ask to Mr. Capobianco. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you've given me an opportunity to make a shameless plug for my latest book, In Heidegger's Vineyard, because I do have a chapter there on Heidegger and the Tao and Taoism. And I think you will find it very interesting and hopefully enlightening. Clearly, one of Heidegger's earliest students, those interested in Heidegger's thinking, were Japanese students studying Zen Buddhism.
Yes.
But Heidegger did not really comment specifically on the notions in Zen Buddhism. Now, he was very grateful for their interest, and he was very grateful for their contributions. In fact, in which book is it? In my Heidegger's Being, the Shimmering Unfolding, I have a translation of a beautiful little talk given by Koichi Tsujimori at the occasion of Heidegger's 80th birthday. But my point is this: Heidegger does mention being in relation to the Tao in at least 3 places. And so it is of interest to try to think about the similarities there, as you're suggesting. And I try to suggest something more about that in this particular book, which is a walk, by the way. Which is a walk. It is a journey. I'm trying to enact in this book exactly what we're talking about today, that we're taking a walk, we're journeying, we're thinking, we're meditating, we're reflecting, and we're receiving this gift of thinking along the way and gathering fruitful notions along the way. And one fruitful notion is to think of Heidegger's understanding, the later Heidegger's thinking of being in relation to the Tao. Yes, yes.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you, sir.
Well, if there's anybody left with a question, you're all filled up with answers. It's
We'll just have to do it another time, Alfred. That's all.
yeah. Well, we can do it another time. We can take another topic, or
I would look forward to that. I would look forward to that.
so we're getting to the end anyway. So I'll leave you with a little thing to think about from Heidegger. Need to share my screen to make it happen. Oh, that's the wrong one. Where is it? Here it is. It's too big. Let's see if I can do it a bit differently. Or just do it not in full screen. Might be the solution. Okay, I'll do it this way. I'll read it in the German. And der Stiller, it's from his the Gedachtes, volume 81. Gesamtausgabe was translated as short poems. The nice thing about that volume is it's bilingual. You have the German and the English. Erd, du Stiller, selber still als Wände. Stier die Gegenstände, erst zu Dinge. Stier die Dinge in ihr eigen. Lass sie zeigen, das Entwende. Alles eigne ins Verspenden, an den Heil, wo nie Befehl, nur Hut, Grace, entschuldet alle Schuld, zum reine Trage, eines Gestilltes Sage. So there isn't let's see, this the English translation? No, it's here. Where is the English translation? Must be this one. The Soothing Man's translation. Shepherd nerves, soothed by the turn, soothe objects first, towards things, soothe things in their own, let them show the theft of all owning within gifts to the hidden, where nothing's bidden, only grace, all sins forgiveness, to what was born pure, and saying was nursed. So that's something for the Sunday meditation. You can find it in this volume. I can put it in the, wait a minute, I can upload it probably in the chat. So if you want to have a look, you can. Where am I? I'm here. 1 second. There's the English translation.
So I want to thank everyone
Yeah, let's
for joining us. And Alfred, it's quite an honor also to collaborate with you. I hope we can do it again. And I look forward to speaking with all of you. And by the way, you can always contact me directly. Please use my email at Stonehill College, rcapobianco@stonehill.edu. I'm always open and receptive to your gracious comments. And they need not be that gracious either. You certainly can take issue.
Okay, thank you, Richard, for taking the time off to spend this time with us. As I said, I think before, final weekend of September, we have another conference going on poetry, I think, thinking. So if you would be interested, there will be announcement on both the Heidegger Forum and we have also a Facebook page for the European Center of Heidegger Studies, and we have our own website now where you can find all the stuff that's going on, the links to our YouTube channel, etc. So hope to see you again. I'm pretty sure most of you I will be seeing again in the near future. So I hope you had a good time at least, and we'll keep thinking and try to make sense of Heidegger. So see you soon. Thanks again. Bye bye.